Imagine a world where sending a simple message meant risking your life, or the life of someone else. Couriers ran miles, dodging deadly enemies, just to deliver a letter. But how did they make sure the message stayed safe, or reached the right hands, especially when entire systems of trust had to be invented from scratch? In this video, we'll explore the dangerous, ingenious beginnings of long-distance communication, when trust was rare, and failure often came at a heavy price. In the vast desert landscapes of ancient Egypt, an empire stretching miles along the Nile River depended on the steady rhythm of human footsteps and chariot wheels. The pharaoh's word wasn't just law, it was survival. Crops, labor, even the construction of monumental structures like the pyramids hinged upon timely communication. But how did these commands reach the outskirts of the kingdom, to small settlements where the sight of a royal messenger could mean life-changing news? It began around 2400 before Christ, a time when governance demanded more than decrees carved in stone or painted on temple walls. The pharaoh's courier system was evidence of an advanced society grappling with an impossible question: how to bridge the gap between rulers and subjects scattered across hundreds of miles. Messengers, trusted and without a moment to waste, carried these royal commands. Many ran on foot through rough desert trails where the sun bore down without mercy, while others rode in swift, horse-drawn chariots. But loyalty wasn't the only thing required to be a courier in this system. Courage was its own prerequisite. Imagine running, sand grinding at your heels, not knowing whether hostile tribes or a lion might be up ahead. Or worse, knowing that the message in your hands was valuable enough to attract betrayal, even from someone pretending to offer help. Breaking the seal on a pharaoh's decree was not only a crime against the ruler, it was an affront to the gods themselves, ensuring punishment in both life and death. Yet, couriers still took the risk, understanding that this role made them indispensable to the machinery of Egypt's sprawling bureaucracy. It wasn't just the pharaoh's commands they carried. Economic records, military instructions, and religious messages also crisscrossed the empire through these early postal systems. One remarkable fragment of written history survives to give us a glimpse into this system. A letter from 255 before Christ, written in Greek during Egypt's Ptolemaic period. The letter, carved painstakingly on clay, offers evidence of Egypt as more than a land of ancient mysteries. It was a land deeply concerned with communication and organization. This might not have been the first piece of mail ever sent, but it stands as one of the oldest records we still have, a snapshot of a world where delivering a letter could feel as significant as opening a door to history. But trust, that was the cornerstone of the courier system. To carry a decree from the pharaoh without questioning, it required not only loyalty but also a reputation untarnished by greed or fear. Couriers weren't just anonymous faces plucked from a crowd. Many were specifically chosen from within royal circles or the military, people with deep ties to the kingdom's stability. In time, they became known not by name, but by function, the living embodiment of the kingdom's most sacred tool, communication. What makes this innovation so fascinating is what it tells us about the importance of communication to ancient governance. Without it, Egypt's massive operations, the building of temples, the redistribution of grain to withstand droughts would collapse under their own weight. The pharaoh's voice needed to reach its destination, as if the ruler had spoken there in person. Every message carried more than words. It carried the unbroken chain of a civilization securing its own future. And yet, there's an irony in its simplicity. For all the majestic monuments, the ancient Egyptians are known for pyramids towering over the desert and statues carved from stone. This courier system wasn't founded on invention but necessity. There were no shortcuts, no advanced tools or technologies, only the grit of the human spirit and the understanding that, if a message didn't make its way to its recipient, the balance of the kingdom could tilt into chaos. As grand as this achievement was, it sparks an even bigger question. Egypt's couriers proved that loyalty and determination could ensure messages traveled far. But what happens when speed becomes more important than trust? Would an empire be able to overcome the human limitations of distance and time without losing control over secrecy? Egypt's methods were the roots of organized communication, yet they were just the beginning. That pursuit to get messages from one place to another faster, safer, and more efficiently would ignite innovations that spanned centuries. What's even more impressive, though, is recognizing that this early effort wasn't a footnote in history, it was the foundation. Ancient Egypt's courier system planted the seeds for every organized network of correspondence that would follow. But as we look ahead, the stakes are only about to grow. Stretching across thousands of miles, the Persian Empire was a collection of lands and cultures so vast that keeping it connected seemed almost impossible. Yet, under the vision of Cyrus the Great and later Darius the Great, this challenge was answered with one of the most sophisticated communication systems the ancient world had ever seen, the Shapar Khane. This wasn't just a network of couriers delivering messages, it was the lifeline of an empire that needed to relay orders, manage resources, and maintain control over its sprawling territories. The Shapar Khane wasn't just revolutionary, it was essential. Without it, the empire would have crumbled under the weight of its own expanse. Messages that once took weeks to travel now reached their destination in mere days. But how? The system relied on speed, and it achieved this by placing relay stations at intervals along strategic routes, most famously the Royal Road. These stations, spaced about a day's journey apart, were equipped with fresh horses and rested riders, each ready to continue the journey without delay. A courier would arrive with a message, hand it off or switch to a fresh mount, and the vital words would press on through mountains, deserts, and plains. It wasn't easy to maintain such a system. The distance alone posed challenges, with the Royal Road extending 1,500 miles from Sardis in the west to the Persian capital of Susa in the east. Then there was the terrain: scorching sands, freezing highlands, and endless expanses where bandits or enemies could lurk unseen. Every piece of the Shapar Khane relied on an extraordinary level of organization. Timing was everything. Riders had to arrive at their stations as scheduled because a single delay could ripple across the entire line. Herodotus, the Greek historian, marveled at the efficiency of Persian couriers, describing them as unmatched in their dedication and reliability. He famously wrote, "Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds." Thousands of years later, these words would be engraved on the James Farley Post Office in New York as a tribute to the enduring legacy of the Persian postal system. But this wasn't just a poetic exaggeration. The couriers of the Shapar Khane were relentless, continuing onward regardless of conditions, something that astonished even seasoned observers of the ancient world. But what about the messages themselves? In an empire constantly at risk from outside threats, how could the Persians ensure that their communications wouldn't fall into the wrong hands? The answer lies in the seals that accompanied each decree. Messages were carefully sealed, the marks of authority serving as both protection against tampering and a verification of their origin. If that seal was broken, it was instantly clear that someone had interfered, an offense that carried severe consequences. Relay stations, too, were reinforced against theft or assault, featuring guards to secure and monitor the vital points along the route. This built layers of defense into the very structure of the system, showing how meticulously the Persians had thought about every potential weak link. The Shapar Khane wasn't just preserved for logistical purposes. It became integral to intelligence gathering as well, extending its reach beyond governance into military strategy. Couriers often carried updates from the front lines or reports about regional unrest, allowing the central government to react with an efficiency that was unheard of at the time. It's even referenced in the Book of Esther within the Hebrew Bible, where King Ahasuerus dispatches couriers to announce royal decisions across the Near East. Messages weren't just instructions in this system, they were tools of power and control. The brilliance of the Persian relay system didn't go unnoticed in the centuries that followed. The Romans, for instance, took inspiration from the Persian model when they built their own courier system, the cursus publicus, hundreds of years later. Though the Romans refined and expanded the concept, the DNA of the Shapar Khane can still be seen in the way they organized their communication network. But what the Persians accomplished, using nothing more than horses, riders, and relay stations, laid the groundwork for how empires could remain coordinated across their farthest reaches. The Shapar Khane's influence didn't stop with military or governmental concerns either. Long after it dwindled as an active network, its principles lived on in systems designed to move goods and people. The structure of postal systems, trade routes, and even modern supply chains borrow indirectly from the idea of maintaining connection through intervals of support and replenishment. This concept, which seems obvious to us today, was a monumental achievement at the time. Yet for all its brilliance, what's striking is how fragile such a system truly was. Without the centralized authority of the Persian monarchy, the relay stations and couriers wouldn't have functioned as seamlessly as they did. It depended on a complex web of trust between riders, guards, and administrators, all of whom had to operate with care and diligence. Break any part of that chain, and the entire system collapsed. The Shapar Khane wasn't just a logistical triumph, it was a test of human reliability on a grand scale. And you have to wonder, how did riders themselves view their role? While their names haven't survived the sands of history, these couriers were more than just cogs in a machine. They were the lifeblood of an empire, their exertion and perseverance ensuring that the Persian kings could rule effectively despite the challenges of distance. It's a humbling thought, knowing these riders endured exhaustion, unfamiliar roads, and unforgiving environments just to complete their duty. This system showcased not only the brilliance of Persian governance but also the importance of proximity in a pre-modern world. Words had power, but only if they could reach their destination on time, intact, and protected from sabotage. The Chapar-Khanate achieved exactly this, proving that no matter how vast an empire might be, it could still function as a single, united force, one message at a time. When the Western Roman Empire fell in the 5th century, its carefully constructed systems began to unravel. Among them was the cursus publicus, the empire's highly organized state-run postal service. Roman roads, once teeming with couriers carrying imperial orders across vast stretches of land, began to crumble under neglect. Political fragmentation left no single authority capable of maintaining the system, and without stable leadership, the infrastructure that held the empire together started to decay. Communication, once rapid and reliable, became uncertain, and the urgency of messages was no longer matched by the means to deliver them. Barbarian kingdoms that replaced the Roman Empire were left with a choice, whether to preserve the old systems or chart their own paths. Some rulers clung to remnants of the cursus publicus, recognizing the value of a functioning courier network. Theodoric the Great, king of the Ostrogoths, understood that controlling information was essential to ruling effectively over Italy. Between 493 and 526 Common Era, he retained key elements of the Roman postal system, ensuring posthouses remained operational. To Theodoric, the infrastructure left behind by Rome was not just a symbol of an empire's fall, it was a tool of governance he could repurpose to serve his own kingdom. And for a time, it worked, keeping parts of the old network alive. Even into the early 9th century, echoes of the cursus publicus could be found deep in Western Europe. Under the rule of the Carolingian Empire, pockets of the system lingered. Posthouses dotted the routes of this fragmented landscape, though their frequency and reliability had diminished significantly. What was once a tightly woven structure under Rome had become scattered and inconsistent. The Roman model relied on a network that spanned continents, but as local lords and rulers carved Europe into smaller, disjointed territories, no unified communication system could take its place. Roads fell into ruin, making even short journeys unpredictable, and communities were unwilling to invest in maintaining a service that now felt less vital to their isolated worlds. Where the West saw decay, the East managed to adapt. In the Byzantine Empire, which carried on Rome's legacy in the East, the cursus publicus survived with greater success. The infrastructure there was maintained more effectively, and its use continued to support the administrative needs of a centralized authority. Furthermore, as the Byzantine Empire ceded territories to the rapidly expanding Islamic caliphates, the postal system had a surprising second life. The Arab rulers integrated aspects of the Byzantine cursus publicus into their own postal networks. By the time of the Abbasid Caliphate, a sophisticated postal system based in Baghdad had emerged, borrowing from the foundation first built by Rome, then perfected in Byzantium. It was a striking reminder that even as the political maps shifted, the need for organized communication never went away. Still, in Western Europe, the gap left by the fall of the cursus publicus seemed impossible to fill. Without roads that could be trusted and a stable authority to coordinate long-distance communication, people had only themselves to rely on. Communities adapted in small ways, creating ad hoc courier systems to transport letters or goods to neighboring towns. These were not grand networks reaching across empires, but they served the immediate needs of the local population. Religious institutions, with monasteries acting as hubs of learning and refuge, also played a role in keeping correspondence alive. Clergy often sent letters between abbeys or dioceses, carrying messages of faith or requests for aid. It was, in essence, a return to a simpler, more fragmented form of communication. The fragility of long-distance networks became painfully clear during this time. Without trust in a centralized system, even the smallest failure could halt the transmission of information. A bandit attack on a courier, a storm washing out a key road, or simple mismanagement could mean vital messages never reached their destination. The once seamless cursus publicus had exemplified the strength of the Roman Empire. Its collapse showcased the vulnerability of communication in a fractured world. But not everything in Europe remained stagnant. Commerce, especially as the Middle Ages developed, became a driving force for the revival of long-distance communication. Merchants could not afford the unreliability of ad hoc networks. Business deals hinged on the ability to communicate with other cities or regions. And as international trade routes expanded, so did the need for dependable postal systems. Italian mercantile corporations in particular took it upon themselves to create messenger networks that functioned far beyond the capabilities of local couriers. These networks were most prominent in Italy, where major commercial hubs, such as Florence, Genoa, and Siena, thrived. Merchants traded not just goods but information. Letters about orders, negotiations, and settlements crisscrossed the region, tying cities to one another like veins in a living body. Even beyond Europe, these mercantile networks made their mark. By 1320, Venetian couriers had established routes that reached all the way to Constantinople and beyond, with the King of Persia granting them free passage through his territories. This was not just about economic necessity. It was a statement of the interconnectivity that trade demanded. Further north, fairs in the Champagne region of France became critical points of exchange for both goods and information. These annual gatherings linked Italian merchants with their counterparts across the continent, and messenger services played a vital role in bridging the distances between these centers of commerce. Staging posts ensured couriers could rest and recharge before continuing their routes, creating an informal yet effective network of communication. Even Russia began to see the rise of structured courier systems by the 13th century. Drawing inspiration from both European trade routes and Mongol technologies, Russian staging posts allowed couriers to travel great distances. Horses and drivers were stationed at intervals, supporting what came to be known as a carriage express system. These staging posts were not always consistent, but they demonstrated the growing demand for reliable postal services beyond just Western Europe. As these systems evolved, one thing became clear: trust and infrastructure were inseparably linked. A letter was not just a physical object, it was an act of faith. Faith that the road would not be blocked. Faith that the messenger would not be robbed. Faith that the seal would not be broken before it reached its proper recipient. A sophisticated network required both technical organization and social cooperation, a lesson learned painfully in the aftermath of Rome's collapse. Though decentralized, these new courier networks laid the groundwork for what would come next. The growing demand for communication driven by commerce, diplomacy, and religion began to shift power back towards centralized postal systems in the later Middle Ages. Local networks started to resemble what Europe had once known under Rome, though they were fueled by trade rather than imperial command. Yet, nestled in these humble beginnings were the seeds of a return to order, a way of connecting people and restoring faith in communication. Commerce had taken the reins, reviving the art of correspondence in a time when chaos had seemed unstoppable. From the bustling streets of Florence to the snowy plains of Russia, merchants and communities slowly rebuilt what had been lost. And in doing so, they proved a fundamental truth. Even without emperors, an empire of communication could rise once again. International commerce was not just about goods moving across borders, it was about information. In the Middle Ages, as merchants expanded trade routes and began building alliances across cities and continents, a new problem emerged: how to stay connected when no official systems for mail existed. With every deal depending on timing, every shipment tied to precise agreements, and every negotiation hinging on trust, communication had to flow, even if the infrastructure did not yet exist. Merchants could not rely on chance. Conducting business across long distances meant they needed a way to send letters detailing orders, payments, and terms of trade safely and efficiently. But the lack of a central postal system left them vulnerable. Roads were unreliable, bandits roamed freely, and every message had to pass through a maze of local territories, each with its own rules, risks, and opportunities for delays. Yet for merchants, the stakes were too high to leave correspondence to luck. They needed solutions. Italian mercantile corporations were among the first to address this challenge on an organized scale. By the mid-13th century, Florence, Genoa, and Siena had become bustling centers of trade, linked not only by their commercial ambitions but by the messenger systems they created. These were not casual arrangements. They were sophisticated networks designed to ensure correspondence reached its destination. Letters were not handed off blindly to the first available rider. Instead, corporations set established routes and fixed schedules, sending dispatches to key destinations at regular intervals. The Champagne fairs in northern France became critical hubs in this system, acting like arteries in an expanding web of communication. Merchants attending the fairs could expect the arrival of two fixed dispatches, one carrying orders and commissions before the fair, and another carrying settlements afterward. Even beyond Europe, Italian merchants pushed the boundaries of communication. Venice, with its deeply rooted maritime trade, established ongoing postal links with Constantinople. This was no small feat. Messages travelled thousands of miles, crossing seas and hostile territories, and yet the system proved dependable. Venetian couriers even earned the trust of the Persian king, who granted them free passage through his domains. This level of cooperation underscored how essential these systems had become to global commerce. It also showed where private networks, built by merchants for merchants, were beginning to rival the centralized courier systems of empires long past. But distance was not the only challenge. Security mattered just as much. Letters often carried sensitive information, prices, shortages, trade agreements that could make or break a business. Merchants could not afford competitors or thieves intercepting their plans, so they relied on layers of protection. Wax seals on letters were a common practice. These seals were not just decorative, they were safeguards. Breaking a seal was an act of tampering, an unmistakable sign that a message had been compromised. To further protect their communications, merchants began using codes, embedding disguised meanings or abbreviations in their writing to obscure critical details. Trust was also paramount. Couriers were not chosen randomly. They were carefully selected based on loyalty and discretion. Once handed a letter, a courier carried not only paper, but the weight of a merchant's reputation. In Russia, staging posts became crucial to developing communication networks in colder, distant regions where trade routes stretched thin. These posts, spaced at intervals along key roads, allowed couriers to switch to fresh horses and continue their journey quickly, mirroring systems seen earlier in places like Persia and Rome. Known as the Carriage Express, it acted as a lifeline for merchants trying to navigate vast distances. Though not as expansive as Italian systems, Russian staging posts served a similar purpose, ensuring that a letter could travel hundreds of miles without being bottlenecked by exhausted messengers or animals. Still, there was no escaping the risks. Bandits plagued roads across Europe, preying on vulnerable riders. Bad weather could flood routes or freeze entire regions into immobility. Hostility between neighboring territories could turn what should have been a simple journey into a game of diplomacy or evasion. For couriers, carrying a letter was not just a task, it was often a dangerous gamble. Each delivery was a test of endurance and luck, and not every message made it through. Yet merchants leaned into these imperfect systems, working around the hazards because there was no alternative. Slowing communication meant slowing trade, and for many, that was not an option. What emerged from this push to connect was more than just a collection of local initiatives. These merchant-driven systems began to emphasize structure and regularity. Routes had fixed stopping points, timetables became more reliable. Hostels and secure resting points cropped up along major trade routes to cater to messengers. In time, these informal networks started to mirror the organized postal systems Europe had not seen since the collapse of Rome. Commerce, with all its demands and dependencies, was rebuilding the trust and consistency that long-distance communication required. One of the most complex networks revolved around international connections. Merchants did not just operate within local markets, they linked cities, countries, and even continents. Trade across the Mediterranean depended on steady streams of correspondence, guiding ships as surely as maps did. From Venice to Constantinople, from Genoa to Alexandria, every port relied on couriers to keep the flow of goods synchronized. In this way, the reach of mercantile networks stretched far beyond Europe, driving innovations in communication that impacted regions as distant as the Middle East and Asia. The Champagne fairs are another example of how trade reshaped the role of communication. These gatherings drew merchants from every corner of Europe, bringing not just goods but also letters. Families sent instructions to their representatives at the fair, detailing what to buy, sell, or negotiate. Deals were recorded and confirmed through written correspondence. For many merchants, the fairs were not just about commerce, they acted as impromptu postal hubs, a place where ideas and directives could freely pass from one part of the continent to another. Despite their success, these systems were not without their flaws. Without centralized oversight, the consistency of services could vary wildly. A courier high in the Italian Alps would not have the same resources available as one following an established trade route in France. The fragmented nature of medieval Europe made standardization impossible, leaving some routes underdeveloped or outright dangerous. At the same time, merchants leaned heavily on personal relationships within these networks. A trusted courier might be safe for one journey, only to face betrayal under different circumstances. The reliance on individual trust left these systems vulnerable, even as they continued to grow in scope. Still, the legacy of these merchant-driven postal systems was enormous. By prioritizing security, speed, and organization, merchants had shown that even without state-run networks, regular communication was possible. In doing so, they laid the groundwork for what would eventually become national postal systems. What began as private networks to serve commerce pointed the way for governments to take over the role of communication, recognizing its value not just for trade, but for administration, taxation, and public order. The transition began as nation-states consolidated power in the late Middle Ages. Governments saw how valuable organized postal systems were, not only for maintaining control over their territories, but also for raising revenue. Letters became more than messages. They became tools of governance. Italian mercantile systems, along with those of France, Russia, and beyond, did not fade. They evolved. Many of their routes, structures, and practices were integrated into state monopolies, blending commerce with control. It is remarkable to think that, in the absence of centralized systems, merchants did not just persevere, they thrived. They built connections in a fragmented world, proving that the need for communication can overcome even the most daunting obstacles. Their innovations bridged a crucial period in history, acting as the thread that held long-distance interaction together until the rise of state-controlled networks. Commerce-driven postal systems were not perfect, but they showed that communication could survive and even flourish when necessity demanded it. For merchants, letters were not luxuries, they were lifelines. And though this era of private networks would eventually give way to government control, the lessons they taught about reliability, secrecy, and trust remain etched into every modern postal system. Commerce lit the fuse that communication needed to evolve, setting the stage for governments to carry the torch forward. As Europe shifted from fragmented territories towards centralized nation-states, rulers faced a growing realization. Controlling communication wasn't just a convenience, it was a tool of power. Letters carried orders, policy decisions, military instructions, even diplomacy and ink. For governments trying to consolidate control, a secure postal system wasn't optional, it was essential. But the reasons for taking command of mail delivery ran deeper than strategy. Governments saw not only security in monopolizing communication, but also an opportunity: revenue. In France, King Louis XI understood this well. In 1477, he established a royal postal service that employed 230 couriers to connect key parts of the kingdom. At first, the system was exclusively for royal use. These messengers carried sensitive government instructions along dangerous roads, linking Paris with the provinces. Mounted on horseback, the couriers weren't just fast, they were protected, operating under the full authority of the crown. This monopoly on communication ensured that no decree from the monarch could be intercepted or delayed. The system wasn't perfect, but it was groundbreaking for its time. Around the same period, England followed a similar path. By 1516, Henry VIII appointed a master of the posts to oversee a regular relay system. Though the roads had been treacherous for years, the new service worked to establish a more consistent framework. Messages from London could now reach distant corners of England in a matter of days, a remarkable achievement given the challenges of medieval travel. Like its counterpart in France, the English postal system prioritized official correspondence. Early postal systems of this kind weren't meant to serve the public, they were built to support the machinery of state. But the reliability of these government-controlled systems had an unintended side effect. Ordinary people, merchants, local officials, even private citizens, recognized their value and began pushing for access. Informally, private correspondence started slipping into the mix, sent alongside official letters. Governments resisted at first, wary of overloading the system or losing control of sensitive infrastructure. Yet it became too obvious to ignore. For a fee, allowing private mail could generate much-needed revenue. France was among the first to legalize this practice around 1600, though strictly under the state's supervision. Mail began serving an ever-widening audience, but it came with rules. Every letter sent was governed by fees, seals, and scrutiny. By the mid-17th century, postal systems in Europe were undergoing a quiet transformation. In France, the service grew into a full-fledged public institution by 1627, with standardized rates, timetables, and post offices in major cities. Anyone could use the system as long as they could pay the fee. The change reflected the growing importance of communication outside of just royal and political circles. In England, The public gained access in 1635 after a royal proclamation formally opened the system for sending private letters. This move was seen as innovative, but also practical. More letters meant more money coming directly to the crown. These early postal services didn't just prioritize delivery, they valued security above all else. Letters were sealed with wax, bearing unique marks to show authenticity. If a seal was broken, it immediately indicated tampering. Couriers were trained not just to ride, but to protect the mail. This was important both for state communications and growing private correspondence. The trust people placed in these systems reflected their effectiveness. Even though roads could be dangerous and bandits still roamed, the post was considered safe enough to risk shipping critical documents, personal letters, and money. As postal systems expanded, they naturally evolved into monopolies. Governments actively suppressed private competition to maintain control. In England, private posts along major routes were no longer allowed, and only the royal system had the authority to transport letters officially. That didn't stop some determined entrepreneurs from finding gaps in the system to exploit. For example, local collection and delivery services that didn't overlap with royal routes became popular in urban areas. In London, a man named William Dockwra launched the penny post in the 1680s. It catered to city residents, charging a flat rate of 1 penny to deliver letters within London. The service was fast, efficient, and affordable, and it frustrated the government. Dockwra's penny post introduced an innovation that would eventually reshape postal systems: prepaid postage. His system required the sender to pay a penny upon posting the letter and offered regular deliveries throughout the day. For the first time, the price of sending mail became predictable, regardless of distance within the city. It was revolutionary. While Dockwra's system was eventually absorbed into the royal monopoly, it planted the seeds for prepaid postage to become a standard feature. By the late 17th century, France followed a similar path by declaring mail delivery a state monopoly in 1672. Private messenger services, which had proliferated over the years, were systematically bought out or driven out of business. The University of Paris, one of the kingdom's biggest independent postal providers, gave up its postal privileges in 1719 in exchange for compensation. This monopoly allowed the government to control both the flow of information and the revenue it generated. The idea of allowing another entity to bypass this system was unthinkable. Information, after all, was a form of power. Despite the dominance of state monopolies, private innovation didn't disappear entirely. Entrepreneurs continued to develop local delivery systems or specialized courier services to fill gaps that governments overlooked. The most successful of these typically operated in densely populated areas like cities, where faster or more frequent deliveries could cater to daily needs. But nearly everywhere else, letters traveled under the banner of the state. Unlike merchant systems of the Middle Ages, which were decentralized and highly specialized, these were now unified national efforts, and they were growing stronger every year. The shift towards state control changed communication in profound ways. On one hand, these postal monopolies made communication more secure and efficient across large regions. On the other, they also dictated how communication could happen. Fees, rules, and routes were set by governments, often leaving little room for flexibility. For the average citizen, the mail became both a lifeline and a reminder of the state's influence over their daily lives. One of the largest impacts of state-controlled systems was the gradual democratization of communication. Although governments had begun controlling postal services as tools for power and profit, they inadvertently created networks that were increasingly open to the public. Once citizens could send private correspondence through the system, whether for business, personal affairs, or social updates, it wasn't just the elite who could stay connected. By the 18th century, some governments began viewing postal systems less as exclusive tools of governance and more as public utilities. People from all walks of life could now use a service that had once been restricted to rulers. At the same time, challenges to the balance between control and efficiency began to emerge. State-run systems often struggled to keep pace with growing demand. In the absence of competition, inefficiencies crept in. Delays, lost letters, and slow service became common complaints. People relied on these systems but also criticized them. Governments faced mounting pressure to improve the service while still maintaining the monopoly. It was a delicate act. The introduction of prepaid postage in local systems like Dockwra's hinted at a solution, but it wasn't until the 19th century that the idea took hold in a transformative way. Rowland Hill, an English educator and reformer, proposed a revolutionary idea: a single, uniform rate for all letters, regardless of distance. Instead of complex pricing based on where a letter originated and where it was headed, postage would be prepaid using adhesive stamps. The simplicity of the idea was its genius. Within a few years, it would overhaul the entire postal system and set the standard for much of the modern world. The rise of state-controlled postal systems marked a pivotal shift in the history of communication. They turned fragmented networks into organized, far-reaching institutions. They prioritized security and reliability, ensuring that messages, whether royal decrees or love letters, arrived intact. Over time, they paved the way for universal access to communication, breaking barriers that once separated citizens from one another. Finally, they became more than instruments of government control. They became public resources, connecting people across towns, provinces, and nations. The transformation wasn't immediate, nor was it without resistance. But by the time prepaid postage and stamps arrived in the 19th century, state-run postal systems had built the infrastructure necessary for global communication. What began as tools of kings and queens had become services for everyone. Communication no longer belonged to the elite, it belonged to the people. It's hard to imagine now, but there was a time when sending a simple letter could feel like a near luxury. For many in the early 19th century, postage costs were an obstacle system designed for the wealthy and those doing official business, not for ordinary people. Fees varied, based on the distance traveled, and the burden of paying them often fell on the recipient when a letter arrived. For the poor, surprise costs at the door made even the idea of communication seem like something out of reach. And the system wasn't just expensive, it was complicated. Sorting out who owed how much involved armies of clerks handling calculations and payments. It was inefficient at best, completely inaccessible at worst. Rowland Hill, an English schoolteacher and reformer, thought this was unacceptable. By 1837, he had accumulated enough frustration and ideas to release a proposal, Post Office Reform, its importance and practicability. In it, Hill didn't just criticize the postal system, he dismantled its logic piece by piece. His analysis revealed something shocking. The actual cost of transporting a letter, carrying it by road, coach, or rail, was incredibly low. The bulk of the expenses came not from moving the mail, but from maintaining complex pricing systems and collecting payments on delivery. The existing system wasn't built to serve people efficiently. It was bogged down by its own design. Hill knew that a system dependent on distance-based pricing and arrears payments would continue to exclude most people. Even when someone could afford to send a letter, they had no guarantee it would be accepted by the person receiving it. Poor families often rejected letters they couldn't afford to pay for, leaving messages undelivered and cause for life-altering delays. Hill believed there had to be a way to simplify this process, to remove the barriers keeping communication out of reach for the everyday citizen. His solution was as bold as it was simple, a flat postage rate that anyone could afford. Hill proposed a uniform fee of 1 penny for letters up to half an ounce, regardless of how far they travelled. The idea was revolutionary. For context, postal rates at the time could cost as much as sixpence, a fee far beyond the reach of the working class. Hill's proposal slashed that cost, bringing it to a single penny and making the service accessible in one decisive step. Equally important was Hill's insistence on prepayment for postage. Instead of waiting for the recipient to cover the cost, the sender would pay up front. To make this process efficient, Hill proposed the use of adhesive stamps, small slips of gummed paper that could be affixed to letters to show proof of payment. This idea, a simple stamp, would permanently reshape postal services worldwide. By prepaying postage, writers could bypass the tangled process of payments on arrival. It eliminated the unpredictability and anxiety for people on both ends of the letter, making communications smoother and faster. Predictably, Hill's ideas were met with doubt at first. Many within the British postal system argued against his reforms, claiming they were too radical or that the reduced rates would bankrupt the system. But Hill's vision ultimately found support. The government adopted his proposals, and in 1840, the uniform penny post was born. With it came another innovation, the penny black, the world's first adhesive stamp. Small, elegant, and bearing the profile of Queen Victoria, this stamp set the standard for what would soon become common practice across the globe. The penny black officially launched on May 6, 1840. Within weeks, a new era of communication had begun. For ordinary citizens, the ability to send written messages without worrying about high fees or complicated processes changed everything. Messages were no longer reserved for the wealthy, for merchants, or for government officials. They belonged to everyone. The impact was immediate. By the end of 1840, the number of letters sent in Britain more than doubled. More letters meant more connections. Families separated by geography could stay in touch, businesses could grow, and entire communities began sharing ideas in ways that older systems had made impossible. Hill's reforms didn't just simplify the technical workings of the postal system, they redefined what it meant to communicate. But simplicity also created challenges. The sharp increase in mail volume forced postal services to adapt quickly. Sorting and transport processes had to be overhauled to handle the sheer number of letters flowing through the system. Innovations in mail handling were introduced to speed up operations, from improved sorting practices to better networks of rail and coach routes. It was a logistical revolution fueled by the realization that communication was no longer an exclusive privilege, it was becoming a public right. The success of Hill's reforms didn't stop at Britain's borders. Other countries took notice. Switzerland and Brazil were among the first to adopt similar systems, introducing uniform postage rates just a few years later, in 1843. The idea of a standardized, prepaid system spread rapidly, laying the groundwork for something even bigger: global cooperation in mail delivery. In 1874, the Universal Postal Union was created, an organization that standardized international mail delivery rules and rates. Suddenly, sending a letter across borders and even continents became a practical reality. Adhesive stamps, once a niche idea, had become a universal language of communication. Hill's simple reform, a uniform postage rate, prepaid using stamps, sparked an international shift, proving that access to mail wasn't just manageable, it was necessary in the modern world. The speed of its adoption underscored how deeply Hill's reforms resonated. His proposals weren't about convenience, they were about breaking barriers. Poor families could now afford to send messages without fear of the costs draining their resources. Businesses could expand reach to new regions with confidence. Even distant relationships could thrive in ways they never had before. From personal letters to official documents, every piece of mail mirrored the intent behind Hill's reforms: connectivity as a right, not a privilege. What's perhaps most remarkable is how lasting those changes have been. The principles behind Hill's ideas, uniformity, simplicity, accessibility, still underpin postal systems today. Even as technology transforms communication, the postage stamp remains a quiet but powerful symbol of connection. Hill's work doesn't just remind us of one man's vision, it reminds us of what happens when systems are redesigned to include everyone. By introducing something as small as a one-penny stamp, Hill opened doors to a world where communication belonged to people of every class. His reforms weren't just administrative adjustments, they were an acknowledgement of the human need to share thoughts, feelings, and ideas freely. This wasn't just a reform for Britain, it was a reform for the world. Rowland Hill didn't simply make mail cheaper or faster. He reshaped society's relationship with communication. With every letter sent under the penny post, his vision came alive, a vision where everyone, no matter how far apart, could make their voices heard. For centuries, letters took weeks, months, even longer to reach their destination, especially across continents or seas. Distance was not the only barrier. The process itself was painfully slow, relying on inconsistent methods of travel over roads that were anything but efficient. Then everything changed. With the birth of railways and steamships, communication finally caught up to the speed of human ambition. But how? And why did it still take decades to create a true global postal network? The railways were among the first breakthroughs. Starting in the 1830s, trains transformed the way post traveled, especially in industrialized nations. Before trains, mail traveled on stagecoaches or horses over rough, muddy roads, but railways introduced unmatched speed and reliability. By 1838, travelling post offices had begun operating in England, with mail sorted on board even as it sped from city to city. This was revolutionary in its efficiency. Couriers could now pick up letters from towns as they passed through, and sorting en route meant no delays once the train arrived at its final stop. This system cut delivery times dramatically. For example, where a haul from London to Birmingham might have taken days before, now it was mere hours. Steamships soon matched the role railways played on land. By the middle of the 19th century, they had replaced sailing vessels for many routes, slashing the time it took for international mail to cross oceans. Regular service between Europe and North America meant letters could move with a consistency never seen before. Steamships were not just faster, they were dependable. Schedules could be planned, cutting the factor of unpredictable winds that plagued sailing ships. Combined with railways, steam power brought the promise of long-distance communication out of the realm of possibility and into daily life. But even with steam, international mail still had major problems. Each country operated its postal service independently, which required countless bilateral treaties to handle mail crossing borders. Each treaty outlined costs, responsibilities, and the sharing of revenue between nations, leading to a mess of complex agreements. A letter to another country might pass through several different postal systems along the way, accumulating fees and creating delays at each stage. Sometimes, the costs were so high that cross-border communication was simply out of reach for ordinary citizens. With no global system in place, mail across borders was inconvenient at best and chaotic at worst. This changed in 1874, when 22 countries gathered in Bern, Switzerland, to create the Universal Postal Union, UPU. The UPU established rules to simplify international mail delivery, allowing countries to work together under a unified framework. No longer would each letter passing through multiple borders require separate agreements. Instead, a single set of rules governed how mail moved between nations. Costs were recalibrated, transit was streamlined, and the whole process became more transparent and affordable. Within just a decade, membership in the UPU had grown to over 55 countries, showing how desperately this kind of global organization was needed. It was the first true network that stitched the world closer together, making it possible for a letter sent in France to reliably reach Japan or Brazil. Meanwhile, innovation continued to push the limits of speed. As the 20th century began, the world saw the arrival of airplanes. At first, the idea of flying letters seemed almost like a publicity stunt. In 1911, a short airmail service between Hendon and Windsor marked the coronation of King George V. But those early experiments hinted at something much bigger. By 1919, the first regular international airmail service connected London and Paris, and things escalated from there. Airplanes could cover distances far beyond what trains and ships could achieve, shrinking the world in ways unimaginable just a few years earlier. Challenges, of course, were everywhere. Early airmail planes were small, unreliable, and ill-suited for carrying large volumes of mail. Weather was an ever-present threat, and crashes were frequent. Pilots flew in open cockpits, enduring frigid temperatures and dangerous turbulence, with nothing but rudimentary navigation tools to guide them. Still, the potential was too great to ignore. As technology improved, what started as scattered flights grew into organized networks. One turning point came in 1920, with the first transcontinental airmail flight in the United States. This service spanned the country, connecting New York and San Francisco, and laid the foundation for regular domestic airmail routes. By 1924, scheduled services were running consistently, and Europe was watching. Not long after, Britain expanded its imperial airmail routes, first reaching Egypt and then farther into British colonies across Asia and eventually connecting to Australia. By the 1930s, a network of airmail routes crisscrossed the globe, proving that air transport was not just a novel experiment, it was the future. The problem, though, was cost. Airmail was expensive. Letters sent by plane were prioritized and carried surcharges, meaning that most people still relied on cheaper surface options. Despite this, businesses and individuals needing speed continued to drive demand. Commerce, in particular, played a key role. With expanding trade networks, companies needed swift communication to negotiate contracts, coordinate shipments, and stay competitive. Airmail became an indispensable tool for global commerce, connecting markets in record time. By the mid-20th century, efforts to make airmail more accessible began paying off. The Universal Postal Union, which had long coordinated international mail policies, recognized the growing role of air transportation. In the 1960s, the UPU introduced new agreements to ensure that more mail traveled by air. Surface Airlifted Mail, or SAL, was developed in partnership with the International Air Transport Association. This concept allowed some mail to be moved by air without the full cost or priority of standard airmail. It was a compromise. Letters still traveled faster than by ship, but the cost was within reach for more people. Another innovation came in the form of the aerogram. Introduced during World War II in Britain, aerograms were lightweight sheets of paper that folded to form a sealed envelope, cutting down on the weight and bulk of traditional letters. Designed for military personnel stationed overseas, they were a low-cost way to write home. The idea spread quickly, and after the war, aerograms gained popularity around the world. Recognized by the UPU, They became a staple of international airmail, providing a fast, affordable option for global communication. The combination of airplanes and postal standardization meant that by the late 20th century, mail could move between continents in days, not months. For businesses, families, and governments, this speed was not just a convenience, it changed how the world functioned. Commerce flourished as contracts and partnerships no longer lived at the mercy of sluggish travel times. Loved ones could stay connected more easily, even across oceans. Political leaders could exchange information quickly enough to respond to crises in real time. The world felt smaller, more immediate. Of course, advances in airmail did not replace other methods entirely. Surface transport remained the backbone for bulk and non-urgent mail, especially for heavier items. Trains, trucks, and ships still played vital roles in the flow of letters and packages, but the introduction of air routes ensured that the fastest way to send something was no longer bound by geographic barriers. By the 1970s, almost all post travelled some portion of its journey by air. Planes had become central to postal logistics, connecting smaller cities to international hubs and making even remote corners of the world accessible. The network had transformed, and at its heart was the growing recognition that communication did not just move societies forward, it tied them together. The innovations brought by rail, steamboats, and airplanes turned yesterday's long waits into today's quick exchanges. But speed was not the only legacy. These changes showed how advances in transportation and collaboration could redefine what was possible. Just as the railways revolutionized domestic postal services, air transport reshaped international communication. It was this unrelenting push for faster, better systems that made global connection a reality. As mail delivery entered the modern era, technology was ready to take things even further. Did railways and airmail speed up the world? Absolutely. But they were just the beginning. With communication no longer tied to paper and pen, an entirely new wave of innovation was on the horizon. The world was changing faster than anyone could have imagined. In the mid-20th century, the traditional postal service built on centuries of delivering letters, packages, and official documents was seeing its foundation begin to shift. The rise of the telephone was one thing, but nothing prepared the postal world for what would hit next: electronic communication. Suddenly, there were new ways to send messages through blips of data, faster than anything a courier, train, or airplane could achieve. For the first time, postal services around the globe faced the uncomfortable question: what if physical mail was not necessary at all? The United States Postal Service, like many others, had enjoyed decades of innovation. Its operations had expanded, modernized through automation, and adapted to the rise of industrialized nations. In 1963, they introduced zip codes, which broke down regions into smaller, more manageable units for mail sorting and routing. This numerical system was not about novelty, it solved real problems. As cities grew and suburbs expanded, mail volumes skyrocketed. Zip codes turned inefficient routes into streamlined systems, making it easier than ever for letters to reach their destinations quickly and accurately. By the 1970s, postal operations were running more efficiently than they ever had, thanks in part to barcoding technology. Each piece of mail could now carry a code that ensured faster, automated sorting, a crucial improvement as demand continued to grow. But no amount of automation could prepare the postal service for what was happening next. Email started as a niche technology, but by the 1990s, its use was exploding. Messages that took days or weeks by traditional mail now arrived in seconds at the click of a button. It was cheaper, faster, and entirely paperless, appealing to both businesses and individuals alike. For postal services, this was not just a technological shift, it was an existential threat. Why pay for postage when your message could travel through cyberspace for free? It was no surprise that by the mid-2000s, mail volumes in the United States had dropped more than 15% from their peak of 213 billion pieces annually in 2006. Postal services adapted, but it was not a quick or easy shift. Before the full rise of email, institutions like the United States Postal Service tried to bridge the gap between traditional and digital communication. One of their most ambitious experiments was e-com, or electronic computer-originated mail. Launched in 1982, e-com was designed as a hybrid system. Businesses could send electronic messages to postal facilities, where they would then be printed as physical letters and delivered like traditional mail. In theory, it was the best of both worlds, marrying the efficiency of digital messaging with the reliability of the postal network. In practice, It could not compete with the growing dominance of email. E-com was discontinued after only 6 years. Seeing that letter volumes were unlikely to bounce back, postal services diversified. Package delivery quickly became the new lifeline, driven by the explosion of online shopping in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Companies like eBay, Amazon, and later other e-commerce giants fundamentally changed global trade. Where once letters were the bread and butter of the postal system, packages became the future. The United States Postal Service and other services leaned into their infrastructure, optimizing it for the unique challenges of shipping packages directly to customers' doors. They applied the same principles that had once revolutionized letter delivery precision, automation, and route optimization, this time focusing on handling larger shipments. New services were introduced to meet modern demands. Certified mail offered senders proof that their letters or packages had been delivered, eliminating doubt and disputes over lost items. For those needing speed, Express Mail provided guaranteed overnight or 2-day delivery options. These services were not just about convenience, they reflected the changing priorities of customers. What had once been a system of routine correspondence was now a system of urgency and guarantees. Hybrid mail services also emerged as a creative response to the digital age. These systems blurred the lines between traditional mail and electronic communication. A sender could draft a message online, and the postal service would print, package, and deliver it as physical mail. These innovations were particularly useful for businesses, where contracts, invoices, and official notices often needed the legitimacy of a hard copy, but the convenience of digital drafting. While these solutions helped slow the decline of mail volumes, they did not solve the core problem. Society itself was going digital. The seismic shift in communication habits brought by the internet only widened as new technologies emerged. Emails turned into instant messages, and instant messages evolved into social networking, where entire conversations happened in real time on global platforms. For everyday people, the Postal Service now competed not just with email, but with the very idea of physical delivery. Can something physically produced ever keep pace with the speed of a purely digital world? Ironically, even as communication turned online, some people found a renewed appreciation for what physical mail offered. A letter, personally written and sealed, became more than just a method of conveying information. It was tangible. Holding a letter in your hands connected you to the person who sent it in a way that no email or text message could replicate. This sentimentality carved out a small but meaningful niche for traditional mail, even amid the digital revolution. Birthday cards, holiday greetings, and wedding invitations carried a weight figuratively and literally that digital communication could not match. However, the real opportunity for postal services was not in nostalgia, but in the rising tide of e-commerce. Online shopping introduced an entirely new kind of demand. People were not sending items, they were receiving them. Amazon packages, subscription boxes, and global trade shipments became everyday necessities, and postal carriers evolved into the backbone of this industry. They built logistics networks rivaling private delivery giants, creating seamless connections between distribution hubs, regional sorting centers, and customers' doorsteps. The last mile became the centerpiece of modern postal operations. This final leg of delivery, the trip from a local hub to a recipient's home, was the most labor-intensive and expensive portion of the process, accounting for up to 50% of operational costs. Postal services, with their long-established reach into even the most remote areas, became invaluable for completing these deliveries. While private carriers like FedEx and UPS dominated international and commercial-scale logistics, government postal systems offered unmatched coverage for residential deliveries, particularly in rural and suburban regions. In another response to modern needs, some postal operators took steps to digitize their own operations. In 1998, the United States Postal Service ran trials using digital franking systems, allowing businesses to print postage directly from their computers. This eliminated the need for physical franking machines, giving companies more flexibility while cutting costs. Personalization became another hallmark of these efforts, as businesses could now customize printed franks for branding, promotions, or personalized delivery messages. Still, these modernizations were not enough to stop the steady erosion of letter mail. By the early 2000s, postal services everywhere felt the strain on their traditional business model. Parcel delivery offset some of these losses, but not enough for comfort. Some governments began subsidizing their postal agencies, viewing them less as profit-driven enterprises and more as public services crucial for national connection and commerce. This support allowed them to survive the transition, though though challenges remained. Despite everything, physical mail did not disappear. It evolved. Packages became their lifeblood, but personal delivery services, like voting materials, legal documents, and personal correspondence remained steady in importance. Even in a world where digital information moves at the speed of light, there is still something irreplaceable about physical delivery. Messages tied to identity, location, and tangible presence still require pathways that only the post can provide. The Postal Service adapted to the rise of the internet not by resisting it, but by integrating with it. The shift to package logistics was a direct response to online commerce, while hybrid mail and digitized payment methods gave businesses new ways to communicate with their customers. It was not the same system that thrived in the 19th or even the 20th century, but it remained essential. In this modern era, the Postal Service stands as a reminder of resilience. By evolving with the world's needs, it transformed itself from a network of couriers and letters into an indispensable part of daily life. Whether moving a birthday card, a legal notice, or an e-commerce delivery, it proves time and again that even in a digital world, there is still a place for mail. Throughout history, postal systems have reflected humanity's ingenuity and resilience. From runners carrying Pharaoh's decrees to planes zipping mail across continents, each innovation met the same need: staying connected. What began as empire's tools of power evolved into services for all, adapting constantly to new challenges. The Universal Postal Union, with its 192 member countries, remains a testament to our global dependence on communication. Even in a digital age, postal services still link people, businesses, and ideas across physical and cultural divides. Perhaps the most remarkable part: no matter how the method changes, the drive to connect remains constant. What will communication demand next?